For those of you who don't know me, I am the soft-spoken one in this group, Bob Babcock. I am a publisher, and for the second time, it was last summer that Ed DeVos was here, and we're happy to have him back. He's one of us. Not only is he a Vietnam vet, he's a member of AVVBA. Just paid his renewal back there. Mike, he paid you, right? Oh, don't lie to me.
It's coming, it's coming.
But
checks in the mail.
Ed was an advisor with the Vietnamese division, 2 Silver Stars. He made a career out of the Army. He commanded a battalion in the 10th Mountain Division. I met Ed about 2.5 years ago. He is a true gentleman, a true patriot, a true American, and a heck of a writer. This is his 4th book, the 2nd one that I have published, and this guy right here is the real deal. So listen up. Ed DeVos, come on, my friend.
As Bob mentioned, I've written 4 books. All these are historical fiction. A lot of people wonder what historical fiction books really are. As I tell people, my job is not to change history. My job is to make it breathe. And so the first book is the Stain, about the centurion at the cross. Just recently had its 2nd publication. The 2nd book is called The Chaplain's Cross, which is a World War II book about an air battle that took place in March 1944. 3rd book, which I spoke to you all about a year or so ago, Revenge at Kings Mountain. A number of you have read that book, and I appreciate your comments on that. And the book we're talking about today is The Family of Warriors. The cover of the book really explains what the book is about. These are about 5 men, 2 of whom I'm related to, another gentleman who I interviewed, and 2 more guys who I know their story. I put them into one fictional family in World War II. The patches on the cover of the book tell where they served. 1st Armored Division, North Africa. Philippine Scouts, Philippines. 29th Infantry Division, Omaha Beach, Normandy. 77th Infantry Division. This is the World War I patch. The father of these 5 men was in the Lost Battalion. If you know that story, a U.S. battalion in October of 1917 is attacking forward. An American unit on this side, French unit over here. This unit goes out and is trapped. Germans surround them. When they're trapped, there are 600 men in that battalion. 6 days later, there are 190 left. So the father of these 5 men was in that battalion. And he tells his sons what happened in World War II, which is part of the lessons learned so that when they go off to war. Another one of the sons, 10th Mountain Division, Italy. And then this patch here, the Air Transportation Command. These are the guys flying over the hump from India into China. And so these are the five brothers in this book. And I'll talk about 2 of those in just a second. But first of all, is there anyone here who served in World War II? I think there's one. I just want to double check. Okay. When you begin to think about World War II, when did it start? When did World War II start? Some will say 39. Some will say 33. Some will say 31, when the Japanese attacked Manchuria. Some will say 1937, when the Japanese attacked China and murdered 250,000 people in the capital of China called Nanping. Most will say 1939, and of course this is when the Germans go into Poland. And then you have the phony war. If you think about it, after the Germans attacked Poland, the British then came into France and began to get ready to defend against the German armies coming into France. And then you begin to think of the movie that's out now called Dunkirk. Because in 1940, when the Germans attacked into France and Belgium and Holland, that's when those guys are trapped, and that's where the movie Dunkirk comes from. When the Germans have now occupied France in 1940, what is the purpose then of the Germans trying to continue the air assault into Britain? What is the purpose of that? The answer is to invade. Hitler wanted to invade England. In that process of the air battle, killed 10,000 people, 10,000 civilians in the London area in 1940. And the world did Nothing. Not much. Not much. What did the United States do?
Lend-Lease.
Lend-Lease. We also started a draft, a one-year draft. And then the Lend-Lease, I'm going to put this down here if I may. I'm going to kind of come back to that in just a few minutes. And then the Lend-Lease program started by a narrow vote. A narrow vote, we began then to send supplies to both England and to Russia. That was in 1940. But for the bulk of our country, we just want to stay out of the war. Let them fight it. Let somebody else take care of it. Interestingly enough, though, in 1940, when their supplies are going into England and also to Russia, imagine you're on a convoy of 134 ships. You're leaving the United States, you're going first to England and then on to Murmansk, Russia. How many of those ships out of 134 made it to Murmansk? 34. The rest of them were torpedoed by German submarines. So while we were not in the war, we were in the war, kind of thing. But then really things changed on the 7th of December, 1941. How many of you all, I want you to just raise your hands, had a relative who served in World War II? A brother, uncle, now look around. Look around at these hands. Look around. Almost every, and this is why when you think of World War II, thank you. When you think of World War II, every family was involved in some way, shape, or form in World War II. Population of our country in 1940, 135 million people. Now, I was infantry, so I can use different things with math, so you have to kind of pardon me there a little bit. Let's say half those are men, half those are women. So now you got about 60 million men, 60 million women. If you think of that 60 million men, 20 million were maybe too young to serve. 20 million maybe too old to serve, which leaves you a pool of about 20 million men that could serve. In the years of World War II, how many put on the uniform of our country of the 20 million men? 16.3 million. 16.3 million. How many women served? 450,000. So that's the pool of people that's fighting the war. Now, what did the rest of the people do? If you think about it, where you lived, where you grew up, the women, of course, then were perhaps left without the men there. And so then you think of the Rosie the Riveter. If you lived in Detroit, for example, the automobile industry stopped right after Pearl Harbor. Stopped. There were no more new cars made. All those plants were converted to making bombers and jets and so forth. Not jets, but other airplanes. 95,000 bombers were made in World War II. 65,000 ships of all varying sizes were also constructed during World War II. Think of the things that you ate just a few moments ago. What would have been rationed in World War II? Almost all of it. Almost all of it. So if you wanted to go out if you want to have a dinner party at your house, you're going to have to save your ration cards just simply to feed all those folks the things you want them to feed. Think of the people, for example, in the Georgia area. In the areas, farmlands, what were they doing with those products that they produced? To produce the war effort. Okay, think of all the things that stopped. Rubber. If you had tires on your car, what happened to your tires when they began to wear out? They just wore out. You couldn't replace them because the rubber was all that we could get, was all made for bombers and things like that, all through the war effort. So all those years were devoted to the war effort. So that's what started to happen right after Pearl Harbor. What I want to talk about really this morning, or this afternoon, really, is two of those 5 brothers I mentioned, just to give you a feel for who those people were. First brother is the oldest of the 5, about 20 years old. He actually has joined the service in 1940. He just felt that was the right thing to do. He joins up as an infantry soldier. His father, because his father was infantry, he said, I want to be an infantry soldier. So he comes in the Army. Attends the first OCS class started actually in June of 1941. 90-day wonder, he becomes a second lieutenant. Because he did so well, he then is sent to the Philippines. Got to the Philippines around October of 1941. Think of that time. When did the Japanese attack the Philippines? The day after Pearl Harbor, 8 December 1941. So he's with a Filipino-American unit. He begins to fight against the Japanese and is one of those units that's pushed back and pushed back and pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula. That surrenders in April of 1942. when you think about the Bataan Peninsula, a lot of messages were sent to MacArthur and other people about, we're going to reinforce you, we're going to reinforce you. But in fact, Roosevelt and other people back here in the States knew that was impossible. Because the Japanese at that time had gone so far south, there was no way to get supplies into the Philippines. So sooner or later, the guys in the Philippines were going to surrender. So this guy, his name is Jim. He's one of those guys on the Bataan Death March. If you know anything about the Bataan Death March, about 75,000 men, most of which were Filipinos, are moved from where they were captured to a place called Camp O'Donnell, about 65 miles away. 10,000 men were killed on that march. If you slowed down, the Japanese killed you right there. Took your head off, whatever. So now when you get to Camp O'Donnell, what kind of food would you have at that point? And the answer is not much. What those guys could really get is just survival food. The bananas off the tree, the dirty water, or whatever. So that's what's going on. 80 to 90 men a day died at Camp O'Donnell. Day after day after day. And this again starts in April of 1942. 1944, the Japanese are trying to, because of the losses they were beginning to suffer, they wanted to take some of these prisoners of war that were at the various prisoner of war camps, including the Philippines and so forth, send them by ship to the Japanese home island so they then could use them as basically slave labor. So Jim is on one of those ships. As they're traveling to Japan, ship is torpedoed. U.S. submarine. You kind of think about that for a minute. You're a U.S. sub-commander, here comes a Japanese ship. What are you going to do? You're going to blow it away. Happened 23 times, where submarines took out ships that were headed for Japan that carried prisoners of war. Jim was one of those guys that survived, picked up by another ship, was taken to a place about 50 miles north of Nagasaki, where he ends the war as the second atomic bomb comes down. So he sees all that. After the war, about a month later, he's taken back begins to make the travel back to the States. Goes first to Manila, where they begin to feed all these guys and get them back in some kind of shape. He's able to notify his wife from Manila, I'm coming your way. He has not had any communication with her to him to her, really since April of 1942. So there's 3+ years. Didn't know they're alive or dead. He sends her a cable. See you at the hotel that last saw you on X date, and here we go. He shows up at the right time, right place, right uniform. She's there, but she's not nearly as affectionate as what he thought she should be. She says, let's go in the coffee shop and talk. And come to find out, she thought he was dead. And she tells him, and I've remarried. Now imagine, if you will, you're that soldier. One of the reasons that kept you alive in all those years was the memory of your wife, the fact that you would be reunited someday. But here she is saying, we're no longer married. I've annulled the marriage. He looks at that and kind of says, to himself, he remembers the men he saw killed. He remembers what they looked like, what they said. And he looks at him, he says, am I going to let that define me? Am I going to let this event define me, or am I going to go for it? I'm going to remember the guys who were killed and put this to use. He also thinks to himself, what would happen if the roles had been reversed? And she was had been the one caught as a prisoner of war, and no communication. So he basically says, Betty, I understand, thank you very much. You have a great life, goodbye. I found out since then that there are a number of cases where that has happened, did happen in World War II. You don't hear about that very much, but when you begin to, as Bob was saying, you begin to get stories from people, you begin to hear of those kinds of things. This particular gentleman decided at that point in time to become a chaplain, served later on in Korea and Vietnam. He died about 10 years ago. So that's one of the brothers. Second brother I want to mention to you is when we first started looking at the possibility of speaking, I was actually going to be speaking to you all on the 6th of June, D-Day. But for various reasons that didn't work out, so, but I'm still going to tell you a little bit about that story. I want you to think of a guy now, 17 years old. He's almost the youngest, he's the fourth brother, I guess, of 5. Just graduated from high school and enlists. Like Dad, I want to be in the infantry. I want to do something. I want to be what I can be, kind of thing. Initially, he says he wants to be a paratrooper, but Mom says that's way too dangerous. So he's okay. I'll just be an infantry guy. Okay, well, he is trained with the 29th Infantry Division. They initially go, they're trained, they end up in the southwestern corner of England as early as November 1943, to get ready to go somewhere to invade something. But they began to train in November of 1943, getting ready for the invasion that takes place in 6 June. Tim and the unit that he's with are arrive on Normandy on D-Day +1. As he's in this Higgins boat, imagine if you will, you're in the Higgins boat and he's headed to the Normandy shore. And they notice the boat's kind of doing like this. And then he realizes as he looks that the guy who's driving the boat is trying to drive around the bodies that are in the surf. He also notices that as he gets closer to the shore, the water, which first of all was kind of rusty, now it's becoming red, and a little more red, the closer they get to the beach. And he realizes what that is. Just before they put the ramp down, the platoon sergeant reminds the guy, says, okay, we're going to meet at that blue flag. See that blue flag way over there? We're going to meet there, so get there as quick as you can. Once we all get there, then we're going to go up the hill. Ramp comes down. Tim and his friend get out there on the surf, work their way to the beach. As they're working toward that blue flag, they begin to see helmets over here with holes in them. See a lot of paper over here. Some of those are letters, money, toothbrushes over there, pieces of bodies over there. They see some just literally laying there. Looks over this way and sees about 5 or 6 guys kind of all clustered up with some GIs around them. And his friend says, probably POW Germans. They kind of look at them. They're still going up this hill. But that's all around them. Not only that, but they also hear the artillery still going off over the hills. Every now and then they can pick up some machine gun clatter. Here's some mortar rounds, some airplanes flying overhead. A lot of noise. But they get eventually to the blue flag. The platoon sergeant kind of counts everybody up and says, okay, we got them all. Guys, before we leave this spot and go up this hill, watch out there. We got these medics coming by with some wounded guys coming down. Kind of moves them over a little bit. When we get up this hill, I want you to keep something in mind. Our unit's primarily from Virginia, 29th Infantry. And as you know, a lot of those guys are from different towns. And I heard last night, as before we got on the boat, that one unit was from a guy from Bedford, Virginia. 30 of those guys were killed here yesterday. 30 of them. So when you go up that hill today, I want you to think about those guys from Bedford. And I want you to think about the train's over. Train's over. In a classic infantry way, follow me. And they go up the hill. 30 days later, Tim is now a buck sergeant. Most of the other guys have been killed or wounded. He's out on an LPOP with another soldier and is captured by the Germans about 4 or 5 kilometers out of St. Lo. Germans begin then to move him and other prisoners back through France, Luxembourg. He escapes in Germany, escapes from work, and hides out in a German farmhouse. The German farmhouse lady finds him. In the pidgin German, pidgin English, they kind of understand each other. And he finds out that this lady's husband was a German POW. He's being kept in the States. The lady says that because he's being kept very well, and I know he's being kept well, I'm going to keep you safe too. I'm going to hide you out. Because if I turn you over, it's going to go very badly for you. So she hid him out for 2 months until the Allies came by and that guy was freed. The story, as Bob was mentioning about stories, that story actually is one that could have stayed hidden. The gentleman, after the war, he owns a number of different barbecue restaurants in Charleston. And I knew him quite well from church and everything. So I was at his barbecue place one time and noticed a picture of him at the Citadel. And he's wearing a Citadel uniform, but there's a parade. And he seems to be the one getting some awards. And I'm kind of saying, what's going on? He says, well, after the war, those of us that had served in World War II, then we became part of the Corps Cadets, and they had a special ceremony for us. So I said, well, what did you do? And that's when this story that I just told you came out. And so when you see a World War II guy, a Korea guy, and you see a picture, you might want to ask, what's the picture about? You may find out something like what I found out also, because those stories are there. And we just need to ask. One of the things I would recommend to you as you begin to think about those guys that you see them in Walmart with World War II on their hats, again, just, sir, what did you do? Where did you serve? Because if we don't get those stories out of them now, when they're dead, those stories are gone. And you might find some great things in there. Before I ask you for any questions or to give you those, let me give you a couple more thoughts about World War II guys. Because the second book I mentioned, the Chaplain's Cross book, which is an air battle in World War II, that particular bomb group is still alive and well today. My father was on that mission, but never really talked about it. But because I get to go to these different reunions, we have a chance to still see those 6 or 7 or 8 World War II guys who are still living. I think for you all as Vietnam veterans can appreciate some of their answers. I asked this one gentleman the last reunion, which was in Nashville in September, knowing that the Family of Warriors book was going to come out, I asked him, what was the feeling in World War II times about serving? He said without hesitation, to do anything else would have been embarrassing. Now think of that in today's context. To do anything else would have been embarrassing. That was the feeling in World War II. That was the feeling of your father, your uncles, my uncles. Another guy there who I dearly love was a 22-year-old B-24 pilot. Now I want you to think about this. 22, he is the pilot. 9 guys behind him. He's in charge. 22 years old. Survives the war. And so at the reunion, he comes up to me, and his name is Jack. And he says, I'm here at the reunion by myself, and I'm kind of going, okay, Jack. He said, yeah, my 79-year-old girlfriend traded me in for a younger model. But he said, but I got back at her. I've got a new girlfriend. She drives a Corvette and likes to go to air shows. And I like that story simply because the spirit of these guys, the spirit and the vitality are still there. And again, I'd like to tap into that and ask you to do the same. For those World War II relatives that you have, just tap into that vitality. Tap into who they are. Because I think it tells us a lot about us as well. 2 more thoughts and then I'll stop. Both rhetorical questions. I want you to think about the mother and the father of these 5 men. I want you to think about the fact that you're the father or the mother and you're putting your sons, all 5 of them, on a train to go someplace to go fight the war. What are your emotions? And as you think about that, almost everyone in this room has been on the other side of that question. Because either we have been receiving that from our fathers and mothers, and perhaps like me, I've then had to do the same thing for my son. Many of you had the same experience. What do we tell them? I think if you begin to think about emotions, I think for most of us, the 2 basic emotions are fear and pride. Fear and pride. And I mention that word pride because when you see our service members today, here in Atlanta or where we live near Augusta, I always try to make it a point to go up to people in uniform and just tell me what you're doing. Are you having a good Army day? What's going on? Just get them to start talking. Because so few civilians will do that. We're not civilians. We have a different view. But I would ask you to consider that in terms of just how you can relate to those folks that are around today. The other thing I'd ask you to consider is, as you look at World War II books or any book about war, Civil War, World War I, doesn't make any difference. Try and put what you read in the context of what's going on. Think about that for just a second. Let's assume for a moment, each one of you is President Truman. Congratulations, very good job. Okay, you're now the president. It's now May 1945. Some guys come into your office and they say, boss, we've got this thing we need to tell you about. It's called the Manhattan Project. And you look at them and say, what's the Manhattan Project? Because Roosevelt had never told Truman about it. And all of a sudden they're briefing and say, we got this bomb and we're going to test it. And if it works, it's going to be your decision to use it on Japan or not. As you think about that, Mr. President, as lethal as it may be, our estimates are that we will lose between 500,000 and 1 million soldiers when we invade Japan. Also, sir, if you will consider that the guys who just won the war in Europe, since we just defeated them, are now preparing to get on ships to then sail around to be part of that invasion force that's going to go into Japan because we need about 100 divisions to do it. So if the test works like we think it is, we're going to come in to you and ask you for a decision on this. I go through all that simply because sometimes people say, well, I wouldn't have dropped the bomb. That was a terrible thing to do. Well, yeah. Put it in the context of you're the guy making the decision. What would you do? What do you want Truman to do? So there's just a lot of things in terms of context when you read this book. So I guess I really want to leave you with one other thought. Well, first, any questions, first of all? Any questions I can answer? Again, all these books are in the back there. If some of you who are Kindle people and not soft book readers, hard book readers, all the books that we have are also on Kindle through Amazon, and we can give you a card on that if that's your pleasure. But the books I've just mentioned, they're all back there in the back for you today. I ran across a quote, and when I read the book, I kind of went, and I knew I was coming here, and I thought this would be a great way for me to thank you for the people who are here. This quote comes from a guy named Steve Russell. His unit was 122 Infantry. They were part of the force that captured Saddam Hussein. When Russell then gets back to Fort Hood and at his change of command ceremony, these are his last words. They're obviously written for guys that had been in his unit in Iraq, but they're applicable to this group today. Russell finishes, "Someday your peers will look back on their lives and wish they were you." You've had that experience, and I have too. Guys who did not serve in Vietnam can't understand, they can't relate in many cases to what we did. Someday your peers will look back on their lives and wish they were you. When your nation called, it was you who answered the call. Regardless of what people may think of your service or of this war, no one can take it away from what you achieved, ever. So when we think about this film coming out here about Vietnam and what it'll say or what it won't say, no one can take away what you achieved, ever. He goes on to say, as the decades pass and we grow old together, we must remember not only what has been accomplished, but what the cost was as well. Each one of you can look back and remember the cost of where you were and what you did. Only we carry the memory of the fallen. It is we who know their faces, their smiles, their stories, and their sacrifice. They are now just a name, but as long as we have breath, they will live. They will live. And you know who those people are in your life. Thank you for the opportunity to be here again. Rangers lead the way.